Edward Slingerland, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
So your book is Trying Not to Try, and it's about the art and science of spontaneity. And you approach this by looking at what ancient Chinese philosophers, how they approached spontaneity. So there's two big concepts that you talk about in this book that is going to connect our conversation. So the first is wu wei. And I guess this was the word that Chinese philosophers used to describe the spontaneity you're talking about. Can you talk a little bit more about what exactly you mean by spontaneous and what these philosophers meant by wu wei and spontaneity?
Yeah, so the wu wei literally means no doing or non-doing. It's sometimes translated as inaction, but I think really the best translation for it is something like effortless action. So it's a state where you lose a sense of yourself as an agent. You have a feeling that you're not exerting effort or even really doing anything, and yet everything works out perfectly. So it's a bit like being in the zone as an athlete. So you have these stories in the early Chinese texts of a skillful butcher who cuts up this enormous ox, and he just kind of moves his knife through it and it falls apart. And the Lord who's watching him is amazed because it seems like magic that he could do this so skillfully. Or you have these people who are in social situations. So you have the Confucius moving through social situations or political, diplomatic situations with this effortless ease. And he doesn't seem to be trying, he doesn't seem to be really working at it, and yet everything works out.
And so why were they, well, here's another first question. Like, how does it connect to this other concept of, is it Deduh? D-E?
Yeah. Duh. It's
duh.
actually pronounced duh, like no duh.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, in modern Mandarin. Yeah, so if you're in a state of wu wei, you get this power called duh, which maybe you translate as charisma, charismatic power. So it is something that if you're a Confucian, attracts people to you and makes them want to follow you. So the ideal Confucian ruler is in a state of wu wei, and then everything just falls into order around him. He doesn't have to command people to follow him. Everyone just wants to follow him. If you're a Taoist, if you're a Laozian Taoist, it does the same thing. It kind of brings the world into order, but no one knows that you're doing it. You're kind of this dark figure that no one knows about, and yet suddenly everyone feels natural and starts acting naturally. And if you're a Zhuangzian, this other Taoist thinker, it seems to be a kind of power that relaxes people around you. So they feel comfortable around you. It helps. It's almost like a kind of spiritual therapy you have in other people when you can emanate this power of duh. So it's a power that you get when you're in a state of wu wei.
Interesting. And what I found was curious is that all these different philosophers who were talking about how to achieve wu wei, they all sort of came to rise during the same time period, which is, I guess, the Warring States period. Mm-hmm. Do historians have any idea why that is?
Well, a lot of things happened in the Warring States period. So this was really when Chinese philosophy starts. So it's the beginning of explicit philosophizing in China. And it's probably because it was a period of, first of all, expanding population and expanding literacy. So you have a lot more people who are actually able to write thoughts down. But I think primarily it was a period of chaos. So it was a period where China was divided into these various states who were all fighting viciously with one another to try to obtain supremacy. So eventually, one of them succeeded in swallowing up all the others, and that became the Qin dynasty, the first unifier of China. But I think what was interesting is you have all these different states. They all have courts, so the rulers of these various states have essentially think tanks. So they have these academies where they invite thinkers to come and give them advice about how to be successful. And it's not an academic issue because they're in danger of being wiped out. So it was really a time of creativity. You get a lot of schools where all the major indigenous schools of thought in China arise. And they're not just focused on wu wei. There are actually a lot of thinkers who are opposed to wu wei and think you need to use rationality or cognitive control to properly order a state. But I think all of this is happening in this time period because it really is when the intellectual foundations of Chinese thought get laid.
Interesting. And what I thought was interesting about some of the differences between, say, Western thought. So in Western philosophy, the whole top-down rational approach won out. But in wu wei, it seemed it was relying more on what you call hot cognition, right? That's just like not even have to thinking about what you're doing and things will just work out. But also the emphasis on community. So I think in Western philosophy, it's very individualistic.
Yep.
And But in Chinese or the Wu-Wei concept, community seemed to play a big role in it. Can you describe the role community play in Wu-Wei?
Yeah, so first of all, Wu-Wei does involve some cold cognition. So there's cognitive scientists talk about two systems sometimes. So we've got the hot system, which is tacit. It's mostly unconscious. It's very fast. It's frugal. It does most of what we do during the day. We also have this ability to switch into cold cognition. So this is relatively slow, conscious, rational, calculating. There are two different modes in which we can engage in cognition. And what you see is a tendency and Western, you can make these generalizations about the West and the East that are almost always inaccurate. But, plausibly, you could say the dominant models of ethics in the West in the past few hundred years have focused on what I'd call cold models. So ethics is about either following rules, so following maxims, or calculating utility. So if you're a utilitarian, calculating what the best payoff is and then making yourself do it. And they're both cognitive control models. So what you want to do, what your hot system wants to do is not what you should do. And so what you have to do as an ethicist or as an ethical person is engage in cold cognition, figure out what the right thing to do is, and then force yourself to do it, force your hot cognition to do it. In this Chinese idea of Wu-Wei, they also are, most of them, not necessarily the Taoists, but certainly the Confucians, are suspicious of the kind of hot cognition we're born with. They do think you have to cultivate yourself and use cold cognition. But the difference is they think you're going to reshape your hot cognition into the right form. And so you're basically, one way to look at it is you're downloading insights you get through cold cognition onto your hot systems. And that makes them much more reliable and faster and able to respond to the world in an effective way. And it also allows you to integrate yourself in your community. So the Confucian models are very communal. What's involved in cultivating the right dispositions is learning how to fulfill your social roles properly, learning how to be an obedient child, learning how to be a caring parent, learning how to be a loyal minister. And a large part of the training that's happening is training you to fulfill these social roles properly. But you do see analogs of this in the West. So in Aristotle's vision of how to train people is very much training you to be a good Athenian citizen, take your place in Athenian society. So there are analogs in the West.
Interesting. So, I mean, here's something. Is this concept of Wu-Wei, is it similar to what, I'm going to get this name right, Mihai Csikszentmihalyi?
Csikszentmihalyi, yeah.
Csikszentmihalyi, yeah. Is his concept of flow, is it very similar to that?
There are a lot of similarities. So I read flow in grad school. I actually went to grad school with Csikszentmihalyi's son, Mark, who's a colleague of mine. He teaches at Berkeley now, does the same kind of stuff I do. So there are a lot of parallels. So phenomenologically, so in terms of the way it feels on the inside, it's very similar. So you lose a sense of time, you lose a sense of yourself as an agent. The difference is really how Csikszentmihalyi characterizes what distinguishes flow from other types of states. So he's very eager, and he's right about this, to distinguish flow from states where you lose a sense of time and you lose a sense of yourself as an agent, but you emerge feeling weakened and dirty and kind of mad at yourself. So like sitting in front of a stupid TV show or playing a dumb video game. It has some of the features of flow, but you don't feel good. You don't feel energized when you come out of it. So he says, well, what's different about flow states then? And what he decides is different is that they involve complexity and challenge. So you get into flow when your abilities are perfectly calibrated to the situation. So if it's too easy, you get bored. If it's too hard, you get frustrated. He thinks in flow, he sometimes talks about a flow channel where the challenges are perfectly calibrated to your skill. And what that also means is as your skill is going to get better, so you have to keep ramping up the challenges. So if you're a rock climber, you've got to always be trying a harder face to climb, or you're going to get bored. So and I think this is an accurate description of certain aspects of certain instances of what we want to call flow or Wu-Wei. So certainly high performance sports, rock climbing, probably also a lot of things, maybe some things in the social world. So business challenges, kind of, striking a good deal or winning a court case. But the interesting thing is that Csikszentmihalyi, when I originally read that book, there are a couple examples he gave that just didn't seem to fit. So particularly the one that stood out was this woman who lives in the Italian Alps, and she describes getting into flow every day when she gets up and goes to milk the cows, and then she gathers wool, and then she weeds her garden. And this is the same stuff she's been doing her whole life. It's what her ancestors have done. There's nothing particularly complex or challenging about it. She knows how to do all this stuff. And even Csikszentmihalyi's own survey data, so he and his colleagues have since gone on to collect data from people about when they get into flow states. And it seems to be for most people in actually situations of low complexity and low challenge. So walking down a favorite path that you've walked down 100 times, or hanging out with family and having a nice meal, or playing with kids. So the complexity challenge thing doesn't really seem to capture those experiences. And so this is where I think Wu Wei is more helpful, because for the early Chinese, the distinguishing feature of Wu Wei is that you're you're involved in something bigger than yourself. So you're absorbed in something that's both bigger than you, so it's outside of your narrow little ego, and it also is something that you value, that you think is a good thing. And so people get into Wu Wei when they're walking in a beautiful landscape because they are absorbed by nature. This woman Csikszentmihalyi interviewed in the Italian Alps, the way she described it is, I feel at one with nature, I feel connected to my ancestral traditions, and that's what gets me into this state. So I think actually the way in which the early Chinese characterize Wu Wei is a broader and more accurate description of how people get into these states.
Yeah, and I love it. Like, I think everyone has been in those states before, and I think we all want to try to force us into that state, right? Because we enjoy it, and that's what you talk about. The different Chinese philosophers. There's 4 of them you highlighted, and they had different approaches on how you can achieve Wu Wei.
Yeah,
and you mentioned Confucius, for example. And so the name of the book's Try Not to Try. And I guess the best way to describe Confucius's approach is you try really hard in the beginning so you don't have to try later on. Is that right?
Yeah, you basically, he thinks you need to try very hard to obtain Wu Wei. So we're nowhere near the state of Wu Wei in our natural state. But he thinks that if you train intensively over a lifetime, and it takes a long time, it's going to take your whole life. But if you train in rituals, if you study the classics and memorize the classics, so one of the contributions I think I've made to the study of Wu Wei is it always used to be associated with Taoism, because the Taoists talk about Wu Wei all the time. People don't think of typically the Confucians as having Wu Wei as a goal, but they do. So it's at the end of a long process of self-cultivation. So Confucius himself describes, he's got this one passage I call a spiritual autobiography. He says, at age 15, I set my heart on learning. At 30, I took my place with ritual. And he describes going through these different stages until finally at age 70, he says, I could follow my heart's desires and never transgress the bounds. So he's gotten to a point where he can do whatever he wants, whatever spontaneous thought comes into his head, and yet he's ritually perfect. So he's trained himself so he can finally be in a state of Wu Wei. And that's what his goal is to get other people to undertake this training.
You talked about ritual and the importance of ritual in Confucianism, and how what does cognitive scientists have discovered about ritual, and how it can actually help us put us into a state of Wu Wei or flow, or whatever you want to call it.
Yeah, so one of the things we're starting to realize, so the early Chinese had these insights. What's happening in cognitive science is in the last few decades, there's been, you can think of it as a kind of rediscovery or a re-uncovering of the power of spontaneity, so that our hot systems are actually very powerful. Most of what we do involves hot systems. And scientists and psychologists have therefore kind of stumbled on the importance of ritual. They said, well, if that's the case, how do you get people to change their behavior? Oh, it'd be good if you gave them scripts to practice or things to do. And, oh, okay, I guess that's called ritual. So the psychologists have kind of been getting back to this point just through trial and error and realizing the way human beings work in terms of our cognition. So I think this is a good example of how early philosophical traditions can be a great resource for us in the contemporary world, because actually the Chinese have been thinking about how you would use rituals and training and these sorts of things to change people and get them to act in a better way. for 2,500 years. So and a lot of clever people have thought about this very long and hard. So there's probably a lot to learn from the sorts of actual concrete techniques they came up with.
Interesting. And one of the critiques that even Confucianism had 2,500 years ago or 22,000 years ago was that, the goal is spontaneity, but you're faking it, right? Like you don't actually have it. You're playing a role. And there's this risk of being what Confucius called being the village poser.
Yeah, that's my translation of this term xiangyuan, which sometimes is done is village honest person or village worthy. So Confucius was very worried about this problem. So you're faking it until you make it. You're going through the motions of, let's say, being a filial child with the idea that that's going to help you really experience this feeling, this spontaneous feeling eventually of filiality. The danger is that you just learn the outside behavior and you don't actually make it wu-wei. You don't actually reach a state where you've really internalized it and made it spontaneous. And he was worried about that. And he was very worried about people pretending to be true Confucian gentlemen who actually hadn't mastered it in this way. And this then leads to the first real philosophical critique of Confucianism, which is that of Lao Tzu in the Tao Te Ching, where Lao Tzu says you should be worried about this, and in fact, your techniques are inevitably going to produce nothing but a bunch of village posers.
Yeah, and we'll get to Lao Tzu in just a second, but the other problem with Confucianism is there's sort of a bootstrap problem, in that you have to want to get into that Confucius approach to you have to desire the Confucius approach to get going on it. But if you don't desire it, it's like, what do you do?
Yeah, how do you teach? So he's very frustrated because he thinks if you really love the way, then you won't have to worry about the village poser problem. You'll love the way, you'll learn to embody it in a new way fashion. But he's also frustrated because nobody loves the way. So everyone loves. At one point, great line. He says, I don't have to teach you to love food and sex. How come I have to teach you to love the way? Where can I find someone who really is passionate about it? And this is the tension that he has. So how do you cause someone to genuinely, sincerely love something they don't already love? And that's the basic tension at the heart of the basic Confucian approach to wu-wei.
Yeah, and I think you see that tension play out even today in people's lives. Like, people want to be fit, but they don't love the way that you have to get fit.
Well, they've got to learn to actually treasure it for the internal goods. You have to find something. Like, if you want to get fit, the best way to do it is to find something you actually like to do that as a side product would get you fit, right?
Yeah.
Play tennis or do something fun. It's also a problem in learning. So, you have kids, my daughter's in elementary school, and fortunately she is one of these people who are born loving to read. So she just loves to read. We actually have to yell at her to stop reading sometimes when we want her to do something.
What a problem.
Yeah, it's a problem. But, schools are really interested in getting kids to love learning, and love reading. But if you don't, how do you get them to do it if they don't really want to do it? And, their solution is, force them to read. Make them read for 2 hours, a day. And it's not clear that that's actually productive. That could, in fact, be counterproductive. So,
yeah, well, that brings us to our next guy, Lao Tzu. Because he disagreed with Confucius, and you bring in this concept of ironic effects. It's a modern cognitive science or behavioral concept. And Lao Tzu seemed to have insight into that 2,000 years ago.
Yeah, so there's a movement, the late Dan Wegner did a lot of work on that, this ironic effect. So you ask people not to think of a white bear, and they think of a white bear. This one great experiment he did, you have people putting, doing a golf putt. And if you tell them, try to get it in the hole, but whatever you do, don't overshoot the hole. They overshoot the hole a lot more than if you don't tell them that. So you're basically priming people with the behavior you want them to not do, and that causes them to do it. So he called this the ironic effects. And Lao Tzu seemed to be aware of this. So he was worried that, in the same way, contemporary, say, situation, you force a kid to read for 2 hours a day, and you think you're doing it to get them to love reading, but in fact, it makes them hate reading because it's a chore. Lao Tzu thought if you force people to act out virtue by doing these filial piety rituals and doing these rituals to show that you respected your colleagues, it would actually make you a hypocrite and, in fact, make you at some level hate virtue. And that the only real way, so he really thought inevitably, because of something like this ironic effect, he actually had a term for it, this term fan, which it means return or kind of turning back. But he thinks anything that's pursued consciously turns into its opposite. So if you try to be witty, you're not going to be witty. If you try to be virtuous, you're not going to be virtuous. And so therefore, the only way to actually really be witty or virtuous is to not try, to stop trying. So his basic approach was, let's stop doing everything. Stop doing all the stuff the Confucians tell you to do. Go back to being natural again. And that's how you're going to get these things that you want.
So he was really advocating trying not to try.
Yeah. So, but of course, this is a tension, right?
Yeah.
So nobody escaped. There's a genuine part of the point of the book is that this tension of trying not to try is a real paradox. And I actually explore from a cognitive scientific perspective why it is a paradox. Essentially, you're using your conscious part of the brain to shut down your conscious part of the brain. It's a direct psychological paradox. And so you see all these thinkers struggling with the problem. Lao Tzu thinks the solution is to just stop trying and embrace if you can really embrace weakness and not try to be strong, then in the end you'll somehow be strong. But the problem he has is this, what I call the instrumental problem. If you know that, then aren't you really at some level valuing strength?
Yeah.
So you're like, okay, I'm going to pretend to, I think a modern equivalent would be people who, in a dating situation, they're like, okay, well, the way to get a date is to not try to get a date. And so I'm going to go out and be at a bar, but I'm going to act like I'm not interested in meeting anyone. And the problem is people like that really look like they're acting like they're not trying to meet anyone. They don't actually seem sincerely uninterested. And so that's the tension. How do you genuinely not want something?
Yeah, it's what I thought was funny, I kind of chuckled as I was reading it, was how much parallel there is to what happened 2,000 years ago in China to what we see today. I think Lao Tzu and his followers, they sort of romanticized naturalness, right? They rejected technology. They'd go and farm with rudimentary tools, and like they were very like hippie-like.
Yep.
And very
they're the first hippies.
Yeah. And it's the same sort of like tensions that you see in those different approaches. Then you still see them now.
Yeah. Well, these 1960s hippies back to the land, they're like, let's go. We're going to be natural. We're going to live in harmony with nature, and yet it seems to be somehow in conflict with basic human desires. So most of the communes that got founded in the 60s very quickly broke down. And most of those people who were following the Grateful Dead around now drive Beamers and are investment bankers, right? So Lao Tzu, the tension he has is, from my perspective, seems to be if he's telling people they have to be natural, and yet if he has to work so hard to tell us to be natural, maybe what he's telling us to do isn't natural.
Yeah.
Why do we have to work so hard to be in harmony with nature? It's
that whole thing about technology isn't natural, but like we love to use technology.
We love technology, yeah.
So there must be something natural about it.
Yeah.
Okay, so there's Lao Tzu. The other one, he seemed to take more of a middle approach. Mm-hmm. It's Mencius. Is that how you pronounce it?
Mencius, yeah.
Mencius.
Mengzi in Chinese.
Mengzi. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So he had this idea of we have these sprouts within us, and there's 4 of them. Can you describe these sprouts and what we're supposed to do with these to cultivate wi?
Yeah, so in some ways you can see him responding to the Taoist critique of Confucianism being unnatural. So, the Taoists are saying we need to be natural, we can't do these Confucian virtues. What Mencius says is actually doing the Confucian virtues is what's natural for us, because we have those virtues inside of us. They're in our nature in this incipient form or kind of weak form, and we need to develop them. And so his metaphor that he uses is a sprout. So we have these 4 sprouts. We've got a sprout of benevolence or compassion. We've got a sprout of righteousness. We've got a sprout of ritual propriety, doing the ritually proper thing. And we have this sprout of wisdom. And he thinks these are these tendencies, if we introspect, if we look inside, we can see that we have these in some kind of basic form already. And they want to grow into the full virtues. They want to, this beginning feeling of compassion really wants to turn into true benevolence. And in order to do that, we need Confucianism. We need the rituals, we need the classics, we need this type of training that we get from teachers. But that training shouldn't be seen as unnatural, because it's actually helping this thing inside of us to grow. And so he's really trying to split the difference, if you want to look at it that way, between the Confucians and the Taoists. He still wants to be Confucian. He thinks he's a follower of Confucius. His picture of what society is going to look like looks a lot like what Confucius wanted. But he thinks it's really tapping into these natural tendencies inside of us.
Okay, so yeah, he solves the bootstrap problem
with
Confucius.
How do we get someone to love something they don't love? Well, we do love it at some level. And I'm, as a teacher, going to help you see that.
Yeah. You talk about some of the stories where you'd help these like really terrible kings realize you do have empathy. Look.
Yeah. So there's the famous story is this really evil king, Mencius says you can be a true benevolent king. And the king says, no, I really just like to party and hang out with my concubines and oppress people. That's what I'm into. And Mencius tells him the story about where he heard that he spared this ox that was being led to slaughter. And what he does is get him to introspect and realize that it's kind of like the puppy in the window situation. The king saw this animal that was in terror and about to be killed, and he felt compassion for it. And he gets him to realize that he did feel compassion, and that if he could just kind of almost meditate on that feeling, focus on it, and learn to strengthen it, that would allow him to turn into a truly benevolent king.
The other thing, too, you mentioned, so Mencius has this idea that you have these sprouts, you want to help them grow, but you don't want to try too hard. Because you mentioned the parable of this farmer who saw the sprouts in his garden, and he went and just pulled them out.
Yeah, trying to get them to grow faster.
So it is Confucianism, but not really hardcore Confucianism.
Well, it's not. He doesn't want you to force it. His target there is really these utilitarians. So these people called the Moists. And the Moists think that they're not into wu at all. They think what you can do is rationally figure out that behavior X results in the best consequences for everyone. And so force yourself to do behavior X. And in this view, it's impartial caring. So they want you to act impartially toward all people. Their ideas in a lot of ways sound a lot like some modern utilitarians like Peter Singer. Mm-hmm. And they're similarly rationalistic in the sense that they think we just have to rationally grasp this thing and then put it into practice. And Mencius's critique of that is that it's actually, you're forcing people to go so far against their nature that it's just going to result in disaster. So forcing people to act completely impartially and not favor their own kids over other people's kids or favor their own parents over other parents is so unnatural that it's like pulling on sprouts to try to get them to grow in a direction you want them to grow. You're actually going to kill the plant, and it's not going to work. So,
go ahead.
Yeah, so you need guidance, but it needs to be gentle guidance, just in the way you can't make a plant grow faster than it's going to grow.
And how does his approach confirm what many cognitive scientists are discovering to be true about how human motivation or human cognition works? Yeah,
so I talk about Mencius a lot when I'm talking to philosophers, because I think his model actually has a lot going for it from a contemporary empirical standpoint. So first of all, it's becoming increasingly clear that moral cognition and especially moral behavior is driven by emotions. And so Mencius was right about this, that we have these four feelings, these sprouts that really are driving our behavior. And he also seems to be right that they're distinct. So philosophers often talk about morality as if it's a unitary thing, Western philosophers. In Mencius's model, what we could call morality is just a blanket term for these distinct moral emotions. So empathy and justice, feeling of anger when people are being unjust. And the important thing to see is that these are really different types of feelings. They're inspired by different situations. They have different behavioral outcomes. They have different phenomenological and the inside feeling to them. And so Mencius seems to be right about that, the way to look at it is morality is modular. It's emotional, it's based on our emotions, and it's modular. So we have these distinct moral emotions that are very different from one another. Although we call them all moral because they have to do with helping people get along with other people in society. So he seems to have been very prescient in the sense that he thought that morality was about cultivating embodied emotions. And that's a message that I think modern ethicists really need to get.
Wait, so look, we talked about 3. There's one last one. You're going to tell me with his name because...
Zhuangzi.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I was pronouncing it different in my head.
Yeah.
So what was his approach to Wu Wei? It seemed like it was very similar to Lao Tzu's approach to...
there are similarities, and that's why so Zhuangzi is typically paired together with Lao Tzu and they're called the Taoist School. But that term's a later invention. So the Confucians actually saw themselves as Confucians, as followers of Confucius, as members of a school. They were, fighting about who really got Confucius right, but they all thought they were following Confucius. The Taoists weren't following each other. So as you'd expect, maybe, of the Taoists, they were a little bit less organized. So Zhuangzi, he's classed with Lao Tzu because he's similarly worried about trying too hard. So he does think the solution, as Lao Tzu does, is to try less, to go toward more than not trying part of the strategy. But his technique is a bit different. He doesn't have any kind of concrete. So Lao Tzu has got a very concrete vision of what a natural life should look like, and he wants you to pursue that vision. Drop out of society, go live in a small village, use primitive technology, never leave your village. That's going to make you natural. Zhuangzi thinks actually having a concrete vision about what's natural is part of the problem. So I think he'd be as critical of Lao Tzu and he is actually as critical of these primitivists who are very much like Lao Tzu as he is of the Confucians. So he thinks that the similar problem they all have is they're sure they know what the right way to live is. And he thinks, in fact, we don't know what the right way to live is, that the only way we can live properly is to surrender, to make our mind empty, to make it tenuous. This is this term he uses. And if we can do that, we've got a kind of onboard guidance system sent from heaven. So he believes that the kind of sacred force in the world, heaven, has implanted this thing called the spirit inside of people. And that normally we don't listen to our spirit because we're using our mind too much. We're full of thoughts about we know what the right thing to do is, or we have these maxims we're trying to follow, or we're trying to maximize utility. He thinks if we could stop trying and make our mind empty, this spirit would be able to take over and guide us in the proper direction.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So what I thought was really great at the end of the book, you wrapped this up and you made this connection to Wu Wei or flow. We'll call it Wu Wei. That I never really thought about before, why we value it so much, and it comes down to human trust. Mm-hmm. What is it about spontaneity that makes us more trustworthy? Yeah,
so one of the things I'm trying to explain in that last section is why Wu Wei and Deduh should fit together. So I said in the beginning, if you're in a state of Wu Wei, you get this power, this charismatic virtue or charismatic power. The Chinese explanation is religious. It's a theological explanation. So they think the reason you have Deduh when you're in Wu Wei is heaven gives it to you as a reward. When you're in Wu Wei, you're following heaven's Tao, heaven's way. And so it gives you this power as a reward. But what I'm wondering in the book is, from a modern perspective, we don't share this metaphysics. We don't believe there's a heaven that's giving us this power necessarily. So what's a naturalistic explanation of why these two things should fit together? And I think the answer has to do with problems of cooperation we have in large-scale societies and civilization. So when people are living in civilization, they're having to cooperate all the time with people who aren't related to them and who they don't really know well personally necessarily. And so there's some really basic cooperation dilemmas that arise in situations like that. And one of the things you need to be sure of to get coordination off the ground is that these people you're interacting with are committed to the same values as you, that you can trust them. So if we're in an army unit together and we're going to be sent over this ridge to attack the enemy, I've got to believe that you're as gung-ho as I am, and that when the sergeant says charge, you're going to run just as fast as me. You're not going to be like, hanging a few paces back, letting me take the first bullet. And so how can I be sure of that? I've got to trust you. And one of the things I do is review a bunch of literature coming out of social psychology and cognitive science, suggesting that we trust people who are spontaneous. We trust people who are not kicking off signs of conscious effort. And that seems to be because actually, in order to lie or cheat or deceive people, you have to exercise cognitive control. And so there's something about somebody who is not trying, there's something about someone who's in wu wei that inspires trust in us, because people who are not trying are usually honest. Whatever it is they're doing or saying is probably true, because they're not kicking off signs of lying or trying to fake it.
Really interesting stuff. So this has all been great. We've covered a lot of different approaches to wu wei. I'm curious, before we end the conversation, is there one thing that a person who's listening to this podcast can start doing today to maybe cultivate a bit more wu wei into their life? Or do you have a favorite approach?
Yeah, this is a tricky thing, and the book was marketed as a self-help book, and a lot of people got pissed off because they thought there'd be like a little pull-out section.
Yeah, where was the bullet points at the end of the chapter?
The bullet points, no bullet points. And so there's no one solution, because it's genuinely a paradox. And if there were a solution, it wouldn't be a paradox. But what I think is helpful, the kind of takeaway from the book, is first of all, just having a word for wu wei is helpful. Like, I find that people who know about the stuff, who I've talked to about it, they start using it in their daily lives because we just don't have a good word for it. And one of the reasons we don't have a good word for it is because we don't tend to recognize the power of spontaneity in our everyday lives. And so I think we've really been trained that to reach our goals or to get what we want, and we just have to try harder. So we're not where we want to be. We'll try harder, work harder, put effort into it. And what we don't see is that when it comes to a lot of goals, so happiness, creativity, attractiveness, that's completely counterproductive. That consciously pursuing it means we're not going to get it. And so knowing about wu wei and kind of recovering a sense of the power of spontaneity, I think helps us to recognize in our lives situations where we're trying and we shouldn't be. And actually what we need to do is stop. And how we're going to do that may vary. It may be that, we need to do a kind of Zhuangzian meditation where we just clear our mind before an important meeting, let's say. We know that when we go into the meeting, we have a tendency to talk too much and try too hard to impress the boss, and we got to stop doing that. How do we actually do that? Maybe it involves meditating, doing a little mindfulness exercise before you go in. Maybe it involves actually going for an intense run beforehand and just tiring your body out so much that you're not able to be too pushy. The thing is, what the barriers to wu wei are for any given individual really depends on the individual. And I think that's why there are these different strategies, because which one is the right one is going to vary from individual to individual, and it's also going to vary from situation to situation. But that's where I think having this kind of grab bag of strategies, the early Chinese really, I think, explored all of the logical possibilities you could have. And so you've got them there. You've got these different strategies, and which one's going to be the best one is really something you're going to have to evaluate in your own life and based on what the challenges to spontaneity are that you're facing.
All right. Well, Edward Slingerland, this has been a fascinating conversation. Thank you so much for your time. It's been a pleasure.
Yeah, thanks a lot.
My guest today was Edward Slingerland. He's the author of the book Trying Not to Try, and you can find that on Amazon.com and bookstores everywhere.